The next round of mass federal employee layoffs is now just around the corner. Donald Trump has already fired over 100,000 federal employees, but it appears that this is only just the beginning. Federal departments across the board are beginning to send in their layoff plans, and some are already beginning to implement them. One of these agencies is the Department of Education, which is shrinking their workforce in half. The firings have already begun. This is the Education Secretary Linda McMahon, who is discussing her round of massive layoffs.
Is this the first step on the road to a total shutdown?
Yes, actually it is, because that was the president's mandate, his directive to me, clearly is to shut down the Department of Education, which we know we'll have to work with Congress, to get that accomplished. But what we did today was to take the first step of eliminating what I think is bureaucratic bloat. And that's not to say that a lot of the folks, it's a humanitarian thing too. A lot of the folks that are there, they're out of a job. But we wanted to make sure that we kept all of the right people and the good people to make sure that the outward-facing programs, the grants, the appropriations that come from Congress, all of that are being met. And none of that's going to fall through the cracks.
So essentially, what she's saying here is the Department of Education is downsizing, and its eventual demise is going to happen at some point or another, although it will take an act of Congress to fully eliminate it. And this is a very important move by the Trump administration. The Department of Education was one of the very first major steps in stripping how states controlled teaching their own children. It created a massive bureaucracy that eventually destroyed the quality of education here in America. Let me back this up. Let me take you back in time to the creation of the Department of Education all the way back in 1980. It was one of President Jimmy Carter's last bad policies to be implemented in his final months in office. It marked the beginning of what has become a massive slide into oblivion for our children and their education. It was supposed to keep American children competitive, but instead created bloat and efficiency. By 1983, for example, just 3 years after it was created, the department was swallowing up $15 billion a year in taxpayer money, and it wasn't long before rules began flying off the shelves. And soon the DOE wasn't just consuming a bunch of federal money on students, it was also consuming vast quantities of said federal tax dollars on itself, on its own bloat. By 1983, the Government Accountability Office reported that 40% of federal education funds didn't actually ever make it to the students. Instead, it was eaten up by administrative costs. Because of course it does. That's what federal bureaucracies do. This meant that money that was earmarked for children was instead being eaten up by the billions by federal bureaucracy. And it didn't just stop there. It also affected the teachers themselves. The quality of teaching began to drop. Teachers began having to spend a lot of hours on federal compliance paperwork. For example, the IDEA paperwork for disabled children. So it became more time on government paperwork and less time on teaching the actual children. And it didn't just stop there. The DOE ham-fisted a one-size-fits-all approach to education on all of America. And soon, national standards became enforced. For example, it tied Title I funds to test scores with their minimum competency push. This then altered the way that teachers taught their children. This is where the culture of teach to test began. Now, what teach to test is, and it's an abomination by the way, is essentially focusing the children on memorization rather than truly understanding the subjects that they're learning. If you want to know what the original core to our current education malaise comes from, this is it. This is one of the largest pieces of the puzzle as to why our education sucks in America. And so, as you can imagine, the US global rankings began to tank. And worse still, this only enabled the teachers' unions to grow ever stronger despite education faltering. The National Education Association, or the NEA, in case you don't know, one of the biggest lobbyists for the creation of the Department of Education. And in return, they received a federal ally. The DOE, time and time again, has aligned itself with the unions, ensuring that they were protected. It helped to shore up tenure protections. It gave the schools bigger budgets, the unions bigger budgets, all at the expense of the American children. It protected unions instead of the children. And by the 1990s, a study found that firing a tenured teacher now took 2 to 3 years and over $200,000 in legal costs, which was almost never worth it. This is why you see horrible, terrible teachers never getting fired. And at the same time, urban districts like Chicago saw 30% of their students reading below their grade level. And yet, this didn't affect the teachers. The staffing stayed the same. In fact, it grew bloated and it expanded. And so, stagnation began to set in. While graduation rates did slightly increase from 1980 at 71% to 74% by 1990, the gaps only began to widen between racial lines. The Department of Education never pushed excellence. Instead, it preserved bloat and inefficiency. It calcified teacher corruption. And what do you suppose our stupid leaders in Washington decided to do about all of this? Well, they did what bureaucrats always do. They said, here's a problem, it's getting worse, let's just dump more money into the problem. That'll solve it. So the federal government tripled spending on low-income school districts. And yet, because the bad teachers remained in place, they just got more money, nothing changed. And then that takes us to the Obama era. And this is where things really begin to fall off the rails. This is where the Obama administration introduced the retarded Common Core curriculum. And as you can imagine, it was spearheaded by the DOE. Worse still, they began enforcing social policies within the schools. They used Title IX expansions to do this. And the new absurd Common Core math confused children and the parents. It did nothing to help education, and so grades continued to decline. And all this cultural mandates, this busing, the gender rules, all that it did was show that the government had now become completely disassociated with the needs and wants of their own citizens. And so it alienated entire communities, and it further eroded trust by the American people. By 2021, a Gallup poll revealed that public school confidence had cratered to just 32%, which was down from 58% all the way back in 1973. The bottom line here is the Department of Education has never served the American people, and they have never done a good job in any capacity. In fact, it's only further shown a light on the need for personal choice for parents and for the states to reassert their rights when it comes to their own education of their own children. And that is the real reason why destroying the Department of Education is crucial here, because it will lead to school choice. The Trump administration has argued that the DOE is a bloated middleman, and it is. Its primary purpose, essentially, has become stealing federal funds. It steals federal funds from American citizens. And all it does is continue to further erode education. So instead of allowing the DOE to continue to spend the $200 billion that they now command in both discretionary and mandatory spending, that money will then be sent directly to the states themselves. This will open the door for the expansion of programs like that of school choice. And we can already see examples of this working right now. There are states that are leading the way, like Florida and Arizona. These places have already expanded voucher and education savings accounts for their students. Florida, for example, has a $7,800 per child voucher program. The Trump administration is looking at these states and others like it as models of the future. Once they dismantle the DOE, they can send block grants to the states and let the parents choose how they educate their children, whether it be through public schools, private, charter, or perhaps even homeschool options. And we can see that this is the Trump administration's intent because back on January 29th, President Trump signed an executive order that explicitly aimed at expanding school choice by repurposing federal funds. This order directed the DOE to prioritize school choice programs in its discretionary grant allocations and to issue guidance within 60 days on how states can use federal formula funds like Title I, which supports low-income schools, to support K-12 voucher programs. Not only that, but this Trump executive order also instructed other agencies, like the Departments of Defense, Health and Human Services, and others like them, to explore ways to redirect some of their funding towards school choice initiatives. If the Trump administration gets their way here, this will be an exciting time for the American education system. It needs a massive shakeup. The public school system has been a complete and utter failure when it comes to improving our kids' education. By returning the freedom to the parents with school choice, you will have a chance at bringing our education back to normality, back to a sensible place. Once parents have access to picking where their kids go to school, instead of being stuck with the public school that's assigned to their neighborhood, to their zip codes, It will not only allow them to find the best schools with the best education for the children, but it will force competition from schools that right now are just filled with corruption and bloat, with decades of bad teachers infesting their halls. To survive, these schools that are bad will have to offer better education. They will have to offer safer schools. No longer will they be able to tell parents to just pound sand, knowing that they are stuck with them. If schools do things that parents don't like in this brave new Trump world, that means the parents could just take their children and leave. And for the schools, this would be devastating. Each child means money for the school. On average, schools are receiving over $14,000 per year in funding for each child. So, if you had 100 parents take 100 children out of an individual school, that school would lose $1.4 million in funding. So, if a school fails to live up to parents' standards, they will end up going out of business if too many of them revolt. And this is just as it should be. This is all about the free market doing its thing, forcing competition to drive up quality. Bad schools will be hard-pressed to keep their rotten teachers that the parents don't like. Imagine this. Imagine your kid at a school that sucks. Poor performance from teachers, violence in and around your school. And instead of Big Daddy government telling you just to shut up and take it, you can move your child to a better school. You, as a parent, will no longer have to worry about having to fix a corrupt school that you hate. You can simply take your child out and find a better one with better education. And that, my friends, is key because it will force the schools to fix themselves or else go out of business. And that, my friends, is a world that I could get behind.